Back in 1859, so this is way before the days of computers or any of that, there was a big solar coronal mass ejection. What was interesting in 1859 would not be interesting in 2024. It would be catastrophic, because now everything is connected through these power distribution systems and these controllers and these computers, and many of those things could suffer damage from it. And so you'd lose a lot of your infrastructures that way.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for May 13th through May 20th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 1-ounce Gold Krugerrand at $49.99 over spot. We also have 2023 Silver 1-ounce Krugerrand at $3.10 over spot. And finally, we have Silver half-ounce Canadian Polar Bears at $2.50 over melt. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're delighted to have a returning guest whom we haven't had on for far too long, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, an expert on electromagnetics and EMPs, is a NASA scientist. He's also an employee now of Faraday Defense, which he sold his company, Disaster Preparer, and is now still working at developing products and helping people keep their electronics safe from EMPs, as he had in the past. Dr. Bradley, thank you for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
It's a delight. In fact, if you look back in the archives of our early interviews, and many of the clients who call me these days and viewers still talk about our early days of our channel when it was called Reluctant Preppers and when I had my back turned to the audience and so on. But even in those early days when we were interviewing you, some of the interviews that we did together, one of them was called NASA Scientist Warns Prepare for an EMP, was one of the most watched videos of all that we have ever done. And it remains actually an increasing concern on the part of many of our viewers and subscribers for several reasons. One of which is that our lives are always seeming to become more and more dependent on electronic communications. And I think the COVID era has increased that, if anything, because people working from home, people doing remote banking, people doing relying on email and various types of other social media to stay in touch with family and friends and relatives all around the country and around the world, feel that what would a day be like if we had to go without, or a week or a month, or heaven forbid, a year or more, if suddenly all of those electronic forms of communication which we rely on a daily basis were unavailable, if they were as a major interruption, whether from natural causes or hostile causes. And then secondarily, there's been this specter looming of what's referred to as central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which prove or promise, if you want to call it that, to take our lives into an entire, all of our transactions into an entirely virtual world, to where our ability to even carry on our lives would be entirely dependent financially upon access to electronic systems, etc. So I think, and one more thing, and that is that we've heard rumbles, as we tend to do from time to time, not even tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorists, but all people are starting to hear rumblings from various officials at not only the national but the global level, saying that an EMP strike or a EMP disruption of our basic infrastructure, our telecommunications, our things like water, electric grid, etc., are a credible threat, whether it would be through terrorism or a hostile country or that sort of thing. So you've talked with us about all of these topics in the past, but I would say that surprisingly, now that years have passed, those concerns are as high as ever. And so if you could please bring us up to date on where we stand in first of all, your assessment of the credibility of such concerns and threats. Secondly, how the technology to protect against such threats on the individual or household or state, local, etc. level might have evolved, and what specific actionable either reading or tools, etc., knowledge that people should gain to take on that threat. So if we could start back at the beginning, threat, credible or not, as far as the risk to our lives of a major disruption to all of our electronic lives.
Right. Yeah. So it's where most people probably should start. I think it's where we start on all of our preparations, right? Is asking ourselves, is it worth the trouble to try and prepare for this thing. And in the case of an EMP, we first need to understand what it is. All right. So is it even a real thing? Well, the idea is you take a nuclear warhead high up into the atmosphere, maybe a few hundred miles, so way up there. You detonate it, and it generates some gamma rays, some disturbances, if you will, that then perturbate down and affect our magnetic fields of our Earth. And that disturbance to the magnetic field ultimately results in some currents that flow at the Earth's surface. And those currents flow along very long conductors and can flow into all of our electronics and cause problems. And all of that's been well known for, I guess, about 60 years. We had tests back in the 60s. Both the United States and the Russians both had tests related to that proved this was a real phenomenon. In fact, it was much worse than people thought it was going to be. And so we, being humans that we are, we decided, hey, this is not only a useful weapon, maybe we can optimize this thing. And so they made super weapons and super EMPs. And what we saw back in the 60s in the days of Starfish Prime and stuff like that are nothing compared to what we could do today. And so, yes, we can certainly take nuclear warheads up in the atmosphere and detonate them. Nobody's going to get hurt right away. Nobody dies of radiation poisoning or anything like that. All of a sudden, there's just a flash far, far, far away. And not long after that, there's some damage to electronics all around the surface of the Earth, and certainly in the area that it would face, which might be across the whole country. So we know that it's a real thing. We know that we can indeed cause damage to electronics from an event like that. The question is really not if the EMP is real or not real. It's, would anybody deploy it? Would it actually be a realizable weapon for our enemies? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. We know for sure that Russia has EMP warheads and weapons. We know for sure that China has warheads and weapons. Even North Korea has threatened it, although I don't think they quite have the capability. So one of our major adversaries could certainly attempt to do an attack like this. I think they know if this attack were to be initiated against the U.S., it would be a major attack and we would retaliate. And so I think there'd be a reluctance to do it, of course. But it doesn't mean that the tools could not be released to one of the, our terrorist enemies out there, and nobody knows how they got it, but they're able to launch a missile and it detonates and they cause $1 trillion worth of damage over the eastern seaboard with a single missile. It's pretty effective, causing lots and lots of damage. And so the short answer is I think it's 100% real threat. It could definitely happen. I mean, we've had commissions, we've had studies that looked at these effects, so it's a real thing. Would it happen? I don't know. I mean, would a nuclear weapon ever be used? I hope not, but I kind of suspect it will be. We certainly had atomic weapons used. So I suspect we'll see EMP weapons at some point against the United States. We have used small-scale EMP weapons against our enemies. We have over in Afghanistan, over military bases, for example, we could detonate small warheads in the atmosphere to try and disrupt communications. So it's not an unknown weapons system or anything like that. The part that's concerning is if you do one up high enough in the atmosphere, you can disrupt all of the commercial electronics, our cars, our airplanes, lots and lots of things over a very wide region, as well as our power grid and other things like that. So great big impact can be done. We know it's a real thing. The question is, do you prepare for it? How do you prepare for it? What can you do as an individual? All those kind of things we can talk about.
Now, before we move on, as while we're still talking about credible threats, separate from this, but perhaps related, you'll tell us, is the talk that we've heard from officialdom about a cyber attack, whether a hostile cyber attack to shut down parts of our essential infrastructure, essential services and safety, et cetera. Do you see those as related or completely distinct?
Well, they're related in some ways because the same people might try and do them. They're different mechanisms. I think certainly cyber attacks are much more likely. Even large-scale cyber attacks are much more likely because they're easier to do. You don't need a nuclear warhead. You don't need, get up hundreds of miles in the atmosphere to detonate it. It's much easier to have, a couple hundred hackers sitting in North Korea working on something and trying to crack into some system and cause damage. So it's just easier to do. So I think cyber attacks are certainly more likely. They can cause a lot of damage, though. I think the effects of large-scale cyber attacks could be just as bad as an EMP or very close to the same, because you could take out portions of the grid in a way that cause damage, and it might be very difficult to replace. So I think cyber attacks should not be underestimated, but I do think it's a very different mechanism. You're not using bombs, you're using backdoors and stuff to get into computer systems and cause all kind of problems.
One of the things that happened over the past 4 years that we've all lived through the COVID crisis was this idea of supply chain disruptions and critical lack of certain key replacement parts, spare parts, etc. We had trucking industry insiders on our show talking about the impacts that happened to them. We've had others. This has been another concern. If there were an EMP, even of limited scope, that you might knock out enough, for example, voltage transformers on the power distribution grid, etc., that even trying to replace them or repair them, people normally think, oh gosh, even if you have a severe weather event, within days to a few weeks, we get back up and running. We're remarkably resilient in many of those areas. It's astonishing how diligent and how creative people can be to try to get things back up and running again. But have we had perhaps a taste of what my life might be like if there was suddenly a widespread outage of the same type of critical components all going out at the same time, and there would be not enough spares available, that sort of thing? And then how long would it take to be able to remanufacture those or get them shipped over or whatever? Is that something that people should be keeping in mind, that it's not just a short duration event necessarily?
Right. Yeah. And COVID was a great example of that. A surprising example. Actually, one of the things I think surprised people the most was how long the effects have lasted, right? Even today, you still see some effects from it in terms of shortages of things. I recently bought a car and some of the features weren't on the car. That's a late 2023 car. I'm like, why aren't these features on here? Oh, we still couldn't get parts for that, and that's been years, right? So yeah, if you can disrupt the supply chain far enough back, all the way back to the source level, it can take years to recover from something like that. In the case of an EMP, it's exactly like you said. There are these very large transformers. Think building size transformers, not things hanging on your pole. And if you can cause damage to those, which an EMP can, they've done some studies, if you can damage enough of those, they're essentially irreplaceable. They take a very long time to build. They're not built in the US. You have to ship in these buildings to get them reinstalled. And so if you take one or two out, sure, there's enough you can get it repaired or get it replaced. But if you take out 60% of them in the US, you're not going to get the grids back up and going. Maybe for months, maybe longer. And so the impact could be quite devastating and quite long lasting. I don't think maybe no one in your audience, certainly I have not, but not many people in our world today knows what it's like to live without electrical power for, let's say, 6 months, right? We've never had to face that kind of challenge. The longest I've probably ever been is maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And that was in the case of a big hurricane that came through. And life is very different without electrical power, for sure. You said how interconnected we are, and our banking and our food distribution and everything is related to it. And if you start stretching that time further and further, now all your core infrastructures like water purification and food distribution and your ability to get to your money and all of these things start falling apart, emergency services and stuff. That's what we haven't had to really see a lot of, but that's what you would be faced with if an outage occurred and lasted for months and months. All those things would be affected.
It's one of the concerns that heightens the vigilance of people who are looking forward to the types of things that would set us back so far that we would become entirely dependent on, the authorities to say, look, this is how you're going to get food, or you're not going to get food, or this is how you're going to get medical care. It's only going to be through these extraordinary measures, and only for those who comply with all the restrictions that are involved in that sort of thing for national security reasons, et cetera, et cetera. Rather than people being able to have a resilient life that is where they can have a reasonable expectancy that they're going to be able to carry on, at least feeding their family or going through the essential aspects of life to a large extent, and maybe in small communities as well. So maybe we should turn to the next question, and that is, has our ability to protect ourselves as individuals, as households, as communities, etc., come along the way for the past 3 or 4 years since we looked at the technology together? Do we have any new saving graces of new technology or new approaches or cost reductions or more availability of something that could be useful to make this possible?
Yeah, so that question is sort of a yes and a no. On a national level, like in terms of protecting our grid, for example, which is our biggest vulnerability, I'd say we haven't come very far. There has been some attention to it. I have talked to folks who have work on the power distribution systems, and they say there is some attention to it. I know Texas took a good look at it, and they're looking at hardening their grid. But the short of it is, our grid, if you want to call it a grid, is this extremely complicated mix of all kinds of companies that provide all kinds of services. And even the 5 major interconnects are all broken into hundreds and hundreds of groups and entities. And so hardening the grid is like a true national emergency endeavor that we would have to have all kind of massive effort to put into. And I haven't seen that. All right. I have seen talks of meetings and simulations of EMP and, how it's going to affect our grid. So there's some attention to it. But no, I don't think from a national level we've done very much. Now, on a personal level, well, what can you do to prepare for something like that? It's really the same as preparing for any other emergency. You have to figure out what's going to be impacted in your life and then take some preparations to address those things. The first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to detect when an EMP happens. It's not something, for whatever reason, anybody had ever developed before, at least not that I could find on a personal level. So I invented a small product, cheap, less than a couple $100 that you could plug into the wall, that if an EMP occurs, it will give you some kind of a sound that says, hey, we just had some big electromagnetic event occur. And you might be thinking, hey, but you don't have power. Yeah, but it takes a little while for the power to go out. You might have a minute or so. And so you're going to get some kind of pulse, some kind of energy release saying, hey, there's something going on here. So that was something I brought a copy of one of them. It's this unit here. I don't know if you can see. It's just a little plug-in module. It's called the DEFCON, is what they call it now. I used to call it the EMP alert, but anyway, you plug it in and it gives you a warning anytime you get an overvoltage on your lines, you get an undervoltage, or you get some kind of big burst of energy. So that's the first thing. I thought, well, it'd be nice to have some kind of indication, and we're developing some other cool products like a keychain version of some detector and stuff like that would be kind of neat as well. And then you'd say, all right, well, I know something happened. Now what do I do? First thing you do, by the way, is if you really believe an EMP just occurred, is immediately go to your breaker panel and open the main breaker. All right. If you're going to do one thing, go do that. All right. And the reason for that is that most of the damaging energy that could come in and zap your computers and all of the things in your house is going to come in through your wired connection, which is going to be your grid connection. Now, certainly it can come down through the air and, damage things just sitting on your table. But the most damaging energy, the most likely place that's going to be damaged is things that are connected to those long wires. All right. So again, if you ever thought, oh my gosh, the EMP, I think it really did just occur, go out and throw your main breaker. Do yourself a favor and do that. Okay.
Basically taking yourself off the power grid.
Off the power grid. Because the power grid is going to get this swell of energy over maybe a few minutes that could reach hundreds or even thousands of volts. And that's going to cause all kinds of damage to anything connected to it. Now, if you're lucky, the transformer will go out first and maybe it won't come into you, but more than likely you're going to see some damage. And we saw things like that from the Carrington event where you had this energy come on to the wires, right, the telegraph wires, and cause all kinds of fires and damage and stuff from it.
Could you clarify for those in the audience who don't know what the Carrington event is? We're talking about a historical thing that actually happened. Can you touch on that briefly?
Yeah. Back in 1859, so this is way before the days of computers or any of that, there was a big solar coronal mass ejection, which we in the country right now are experiencing a solar coronal mass ejection, right? We're seeing some auroras and things, but it was much bigger than what we're seeing today, maybe on the order of 5 times as big. All right. So you had this huge coronal mass ejection, which is just a big plasma, big gas that comes off of the sun with a bunch of charged particles, and they come over and they affect the Earth's magnetic field lines. And that can cause these currents to flow, just like an EMP can. And those currents can flow in and cause damage. And back in 1859, there wasn't a lot to cause damage to because we didn't have a lot of electrical things, but it certainly did couple into the telegraph wires. And in fact, people shut off their systems from the batteries and so forth, and they could still communicate because there was enough energy in the lines, they could still communicate. They had some fires, they had some people getting shocked and zapped and so forth. And so people became aware of it, like, hey, this is interesting. You have so much energy coupled into these wires. Well, what was interesting in 1859 would not be interesting in 2024. It would be catastrophic because now everything is connected through these, power distribution systems and these controllers and these computers, and many of those things could suffer damage from it. And so you'd lose a lot of your infrastructures that way. Anyway, it's a very interesting coronal mass ejections versus EMPs. There's some similarities there in terms of what kind of damages they can cause.
All right, so we have limited reason for optimism that the national electric grid would be able to withstand an intentional attack through an EMP, that it's more likely that some bad things would happen because of that. We have some reason to think that we could maybe get a heads up for about a minute or so at home and go cut off our main breaker to our home if we're fast enough, if we're home at the time, etc. But other than that, are there specific static protection devices that we could place on critical things within our control that could help make them less susceptible to this kind of damage if this event occurred?
Sure. Yeah. So let me clarify one thing, because there'll be somebody in the audience goes, "Oh, he's crazy. We're not going to outrace an EMP to my breaker box." It is true. An EMP is a sophisticated, complex waveform. So it has different phases in it. The first two phases are gone before you take a breath or you blink an eye, right? They're already over. There's nothing you're going to do to prevent those. The E1 and E2 events have already happened to you. But it's the E3 event I'm saying that you might be able to prevent damage from by opening your breaker. Okay. And that one can take sometimes minutes to occur. All right. So with that off the table, what can we do to protect our own property, right? Because first thing people always ask me is, why bother? Why bother protecting my stuff if the grid's down, everything else is destroyed? Why do I care if I have a working computer or a working refrigerator or a working whatever, right? And I always say the same thing. I don't know about you, but I want options. Okay. If everything in my house is still functional, I've got some options now. Maybe I've got a secondary power source that I can run a couple hours a day, and I can still keep my food cold enough, or I can still charge my, computer or whatever I need to do to have some access to things. If everything in my home is already destroyed, I have no options anymore. Right? It doesn't matter if I have a solar system. It doesn't matter if I have a generator. None of that makes any difference because I don't have a way to use them anymore. All right. So that's my first answer is I like to have options. So I want to protect my property. I want to protect everything functional that I can have. All right. And so how do you do that? Well, you try and suppress those transients that get introduced from this EMP. And they're complex transients, like I said. The first two phases, the E1 and E2 phase, one of them is nanoseconds wide and one of them is microseconds wide. So they're very, very fast in time, right? And they certainly can cause damage to your cell phone, your computers, your cars, other things like that. And there's not a lot you can do about it if those things are already in use. So if your car is in use, if your computer's in use, there's not a lot you can do to protect from E1 and E2. If they're not in use, you can certainly cover them or something like that, right? So you can put them in a shielded bag, like I brought a shielded bag here, for example. If your computer's not in use, you can put your laptop in a shielded bag. It will be perfectly fine from an EMP. It won't suffer any damage at all, right? They're very, very good shielding products. But what if you have to have it in use? I just said there's not a lot you can do. Well, there's a little you can do. And the little bit you can do is you can try and prevent energy from coupling into it along those power lines, which is what I was saying is the biggest problem, right? So you can use things like ferrites. I brought a ferrite here, which is just a big ferrous material that you clip around the power cord so that the energy that gets on those power wires doesn't just come shooting right up into your system, right? And these ferrites help suppress that current transient. They're really great for that. In fact, we use these, people have been using these for decades, and not for EMP protection, just for noise in your system. If you look, many power cords have little bitty ferrites built into them already. Now, I've got big ones, because I'm going to put it around my refrigerator cord or something like that. But it's the same general idea. It suppresses the transient currents on those wires. The other thing you can do is you can introduce devices that will drain away the transient energy before it gets to your system, right? And there's different places you can do that. The best place to do it is right at your breaker panel. So when the E1, E2 event happens, it turns on a little suppression device and it tries to prevent that voltage from getting too high. Remember, it's only 20 nanoseconds wide, so it has to turn on very quickly, drain that energy away, right? And there are certainly devices that can do that. Good quality surge protection devices. I like to recommend the Siemens FS140. It's a great surge protector. I don't have any relationship with Siemens. I just really think it's a very good product. I have one on my home. Lots and lots of people put them on their homes, and it's normally they're there for lightning protection, but they also do a great job of trying to turn on and shunt away this E1, E2 energy at the panel, which is great because then it doesn't come all the way in, right? The other thing you can do is you can use smaller scale surge protection devices closer to the devices. So in the case of a vehicle, we've invented a number of devices we can talk about that go on a vehicle to help suppress transients. In the case of the home, you might want to just buy like a good quality surge protection strip, maybe by Triplite, for example. Again, I don't have any relationship to Triplite, just think they make good products. It's another place that locally you can plug into, and if the voltage gets too high, it tries to turn on and drain that energy away for you and can help protect your electronics. So ferrites are great. Surge protection strips are great. A really good type 2 surge protection device at the breaker panel are great. Ferrites around your power cords. The main power wires that come in your house, they have too much current to put just a ferrite around. They'll just saturate the ferrite. But we made some very special ferrites that have a much higher saturation current. They're called high saturation ferrites, which you can go to Disaster Preparer and find. And one goes around each of the wires coming into your main breaker panel. So those are the kind of things you can do for your home. Basically, you're trying to suppress away these transients before they get too big. And that's for E1, E2 protection. Now, what can you do for E3 protection? That's that swelling of energy. Think of like an ocean rising up. Really, the only thing you can do right now is open the breaker. All right? There's no suppressing away. There's no draining away the ocean. Once the ocean's coming up, you're going to take it in, right? And so all you can do is disconnect from it. And that's why I said in some cases, if you know it's happening, you can go out and throw your breaker.
So sounds like for people who either, whether they're in the middle of the night, they're sleeping, or whether they're away from home, traveling for any reason, that's going to be tough to make it to your breaker panel. So there's not an automated system that'll take that offline.
Well, yeah, you're leading into something. We're very, very close. We're very close to that. We haven't announced it yet, but we are very close to having that, which is, hey, something's going on the power lines. Maybe I don't need for him to run out here and throw the breaker. Maybe I can do it myself. Right? Maybe this system can do it. And it makes sense that you could invent a product like that, but it has to be clever enough that it knows it's an EMP that's happening, right? Not just any time there's a little flicker of the lights or you don't your breaker panel going down all the time. But yeah, so that is something that's coming. I think it'd be a game changer.
Well, I wanted to bring that up because you just made me remember that people who have, and we living in Florida now, my wife and I relocated from Northwest Ohio to Florida about a year ago. And there's significant, we notice even in our community where we live in, we walk around, a lot of people have standby generators by the side of their house. And if they don't have natural gas, which we moved from first to Minnesota, then to Ohio, and finally to Florida. A lot of homes down here don't have natural gas piped into it from the city. So they'll even have a propane tank standing by just to power the standby generator, just in case they need it. But often there's a sophisticated crossover switch that will wait until it detects that it's time to automatically cut away from the main grid and fire up the standby generator, that sort of thing. And in fact, in that point, they want to disconnect from the grid because there can be weird things coming across the grid in the case of severe storms and that sort of thing. So is the technology that's been around for some time to automatically disconnect from the grid and start up the local alternate standby generator similar in any way or different significantly from what you're describing that would detect an EMP and disconnect you from the grid?
Yeah. What you're describing is something called a transfer switch, which I have on my house as well. We have a standby generator out on the side of the house. And indeed, if you get an event where we get a blackout, it'll automatically transfer switch over and we'll bring in the generator. We have a 20-second lag or something, and then we get power. So that's all great. And that's been around for a long time. It's a great technology. This would be a little bit different. The purpose would not be to transfer to another power source because you really don't want any energy in the system. It would be to completely disconnect you, right? And it would need to do it at the main 200 amp breaker or whatever it is that's on your home, rather than, maybe at some lower level transfer level. But it's a similar idea, right? You look for an unsafe condition or a condition you don't want, and then switch to an alternate condition, which in our case would be power down. In the case of a transfer switch would be backup power. So similar idea, different implementation, but definitely similar.
For people who want to look into their options, because again, I agree completely with your sentiment that you want optionality. You want to have as much potential routes that you can take because the future is unknown. Scenarios of what's available, what you might be able to wrangle through to get through a difficult time is unknown, but you want to have options available. When we had a 3-day power outage, even in Minnesota, my wife started driving to the bait store to get a dry ice so we could keep putting in our fridge. I pulled our GMC outside the kitchen window and ran an extension cord through there. I had an inverter that I could clamp onto the car, so that I could get AC power to power the freezer and refrigerator. Those are the key things we decided we had to try to preserve, was this month's worth of food that we had in our freezer and refrigerator. So anyway, it was good to have some things that were still working. I know in the past you've talked to us about car covers, and you mentioned here there's other things that you have that could help protect a vehicle. Any thoughts on that area before we wrap?
Yeah, so vehicles in general are certainly one of the most important things we have to be safe, right? We can escape areas that we don't want to be in, and that's really critical to be able to get out. And they also help us retrieve supplies, and they help us escape danger. And there's just a lot of different things vehicles give to us. A chance to get back home when we're somewhere far away. So protecting our vehicles has always been a high priority. So we came up with a number of different ways of protecting a vehicle. Now, I'm of a particular mindset, and I'll explain my mindset to you. My mindset is a vehicle is not one thing. It is an extremely complicated interconnection of systems, right? It's not, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of different kind of microcontrollers and microprocessors doing their things on modern vehicles now. So it's extremely complicated. I could see no logical way in which you could just put one device somewhere in the corner of the vehicle and it's somehow going to protect my entire vehicle. It just doesn't seem to jive with my mental thinking. So my thought was, what I want to do is prevent these transients in as many places as I can in my vehicle. If I could put it in 25 places, I'd put it in 25 places, because now I can staple down the max voltages all around these different systems, and maybe I can prevent damage. So I started thinking, well, how do you do that? Well, certainly you can go to the battery and put something at the battery. Yeah, great, fine. But where else can you go to? Well, you can put ferrites around major power wires in the vehicle, and so we worked on that end. Then you can go to the auxiliary receptacle, which is the cigarette lighter. That gives you access to the power system. You could put something in there to suppress transients that might get coupled in. You can go to the onboard diagnostics port, and you can plug something in there that, again, limits the voltage it can be. So I started thinking about all these access points, right? We don't have that many, but there's a handful.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt, because when you're talking about access points, all I can picture is R2-D2 on the Death Star putting in his little hand thing and fiddling around with the computer on the Death Star to try to figure out how to shut down the trash compactors on level whatever it was. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So in the case of vehicle, my thought was this distributed protection would be more effective than some single item protection. And so I invented a whole bunch of little things. I'll show you some of them. This was the first one that came out. This is called the TRAP, or the Transient Reducing Auxiliary Plug. And it plugged in the cigarette lighter. And it does a really good job. I did a really cool video of suppressing a voltage transient that occurs on the wires within a few feet of it. It suppresses that transient really well. I came up with another small one that can go across the battery. I came up with one that goes in the onboard diagnostics port. I came up with one that goes in small portable generators. So I invented a bunch of small devices that you could put into power systems to try and limit the voltage spikes that you would see in that system. Right. We even invented a really big dog. It's not called the big dog. It's called the DEFCON vehicle, but it's this giant, mega, super honking, shunt away just about anything in the world that you can attach to your car as well at the battery terminal. And so there's a whole bunch of different places you can connect into your vehicle. And I always tell people the same thing. What you're doing is you're trying to buy down the risk. Okay. There's no guarantee that you can install 8 of these things that your vehicle will 100% survive an EMP. There's no way to know that, because an EMP has so many variables: the angle of incidence, the field levels, your car's susceptibility, what condition the car is in. So there's too many variables to know. But what I do know for certain is if I put in any transient protection, I'm buying down my risk some. Right, I'm trying to prevent it from developing these overvoltages in it. And people have known about that for years. They add overvoltage protection in cars and other systems to prevent, let's say, a nearby lightning strike from causing damage and things like that. So it's that idea, all right? And that's the idea of car protection, is you add some of these protective devices to buy down your risk. With fingers crossed, you're living a good life. You're going to survive the EMP and be able to get back home and have an operating vehicle. That's kind of my thinking on it.
Any thoughts on people who think that they should buy a 1950s vintage diesel truck or something like that doesn't rely nearly as much on microprocessors, et cetera?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it. My experience with owning older cars, and I owned older cars when I was younger, was they were always broke down, right? So I might not be broke down from an EMP, but I'm broke down anyway. So it is true probably that earlier cars, let's say before the 80s, would survive an EMP better. No question they would, right? The more modern, the more electronics. But you're also more likely to have other problems along the way. So I have mixed feelings about it, I guess.
And you might have Jeff Foxworthy talking about you, because he says, if most of your motorized vehicles aren't, you might be a redneck. Yeah. Okay. How about the other idea of, this is far-fetched perhaps, but I'm going to ask it because many of our viewers are trying to take up some form of homesteading. They're looking at raising livestock, etc. We've even heard that cattle are at danger of, even in a lightning storm, if they're out and they're exposed, depending which way they're facing, long ways or short ways to where the lightning comes down. This is partly tongue in cheek, but maybe you'll tell me it's actually serious. Could you put something on a saddle on your cows and help protect them from atmospheric discharges if that's of a concern? Or is it just better to get them inside the barn? And is there anything you can do to a barn that's sheltering your livestock?
Well, that is a question that would be hard to answer. So first thing to know is an EMP won't hurt any cows or any people. So EMP doesn't have any real effect on biological entities. There's not enough energy for long enough to cause that kind of damage. Unlike lightning, which even if it doesn't hit you, it can hit nearby you and cause you all kinds of problems, right? Cow or person. Being in a grounded, sheltered structure can certainly save your life in the event of a lightning strike. So I assume that's true of a cow. Now, could you do something to protect a cow out in a field? I don't know. It's a fascinating question. All right. It's a great question, but I don't know the answer to that.
All right. So if you have a choice between a wooden barn and a steel barn, like a pole barn, you're saying go for the groundable, conductive barn, perhaps. Is there any reason to believe that a metal structure is more likely to get struck by lightning than a wooden structure?
Well, it probably is. I was talking from an EMP standpoint. Certainly, a metal barn would be better for you because it'll shield your contents. From a lightning strike, a well-grounded metal structure is okay if it gets hit. It probably is more likely to get hit. But if it's grounded, you'd be okay. The energy is going to flow along the surface of the barn and go to ground. But yeah, I don't want to be inside of it if it gets hit anyway. It's going to scare the bits out of me. So half the cows may die of a heart attack at that time. I don't know. I was in an airplane once that got hit by lightning. I mean, it was frightening. It was like a gunshot went off inside the main cabin of the airplane. It was very scary.
Well, it wasn't entirely fair of me to take the questioning in a completely direction far away from EMP, but I thought I would pull in the
Yeah.
idea of how do you protect your livestock and other things. And it sounds like maybe in a set of grounded shelter is not a bad idea. You also have car covers, I think.
We make car covers out of a conductive cloth. I brought a little piece of it here just so you can get an idea of what it is. It's sort of this green, almost feels like a denim, but it's made with stainless steel thread. And so there's stainless steel fibers all throughout it. And you basically just build up a big tarp, if you will, and you lay it over your vehicle, and it acts like a big shield. The energy comes in, reflects off, or gets absorbed, and does pretty well. So I actually I got a copy of my book here. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's this EMP Attacks and Solar Storms. And in it, I built a full-size, before we did cloth, I built a full-size cover out of aluminum foil. And I have some pictures of it in the book there, and tested it in front of my neighbors who thought I was out of my mind to see how well it shielded versus various frequencies and everything. It was really fascinating to do.
So this takes me into the next off the wall question. Before I can't resist it though. Any sanity in having a outfit, coveralls or whatever made from that material for putting over a person?
For protection from?
I guess not, because an EMP is not going to harm a person that is a biological.
No, an EMP won't hurt any person. It won't shock anybody either. People were worried sometimes they're holding their car, touching their car, it might shock them or something. It doesn't have that kind of energy to do that. Now, but it is a fair question about the clothing, because you do see online metallized clothing. Usually it's made out of silver fabric. And they actually do a really good job of shielding, but they're not for EMP protection or lightning protection. I don't think you'd want to wear them during a lightning storm. But anyway, they're for EMF protection, right? Electromagnetic fields from, let's say, Wi-Fi or 5G or whatever you're worried about, right? And they do a pretty good job of that. I got into that area a while back with some students. We tested a bunch of stuff, and it's some people are hyper. I know people think it's kooky hat, right? You got to put your crazy hat on and all that, but there are people, I truly believe there are people who are hypersensitive to electromagnetic fields, and they write me with these heartfelt stories. I mean, just heartfelt stories about how they're being affected. Their lives are just, they're suffering all these various kind of, headaches and illnesses and stuff. And I'll tell them about shielding products, the bedding that you can sleep under that will help reduce the field and stuff. Now, whether it's psychosomatic or not, I don't know, but it helps people, and they say their health improves from it. So clothing like that, conductive clothing, it's expensive. Might pay $100 for a shirt or something, but maybe, if you're really suffering from something, it might help you. So it's worth looking at. Also heard of conductive paint for your interior of your bedroom in particular, or drapes that are of conductive material to make sure your bedroom at least is a haven, and don't keep your 5G router and your cell phone chargers and everything in your bedroom with you, but have them far as you can get them in your house.
we were looking at homestead properties all over Florida and did buy a type of a meter, because some of these properties you could have line of sight to high voltage power lines or transformer stations and that sort of thing, just to see what are you being exposed to if you were to purchase that property, because there is this idea about distance and proximity being an important factor to the strength of the fields. We were staying in a hotel and took walks on a nearby small road and went underneath some high voltage power lines where cows were grazing in the field, and we could feel the hair standing up on our arms as we passed underneath the power lines. And who knows what effects that could potentially have if you have long-term exposure to that.
Yeah, we had a few years back, I took a couple of grad students and we did the exact thing. We went out to power lines, big high voltage power lines, all in the area in Virginia here, and took measurements. And what we found was that they built houses at a distance where the fields had dropped down enough where you couldn't really measure them at the back porch. If you stood on the back porch, they were just below the meter level, and we had very good meters. But if you got to the edge of the property, you could pick it up quite strong. And certainly if you got underneath the wires, you were well in exceedance of the max allowed levels per, the OSHA standards or the IEEE standards. And so, yeah, I wouldn't want to build my house too terribly close to it. Now, I think the builders knew if I go far enough back, nobody can really claim, you're harmed in your house. But it is something worth looking at if you feel sensitive to electric fields, sure.
Well, and now, Dr. Bradley, you mentioned a book that people should be able to take advantage of. Is there a single place that they can go to where they'll see all your books? Because you've got a whole bunch of different books you've written.
Yeah, I think I have about 20 different books altogether. They can go to Watchman Press, watchmanpress.com, and they can use a code I put at the top of the page to save 25% called City Prepping, and save 25% off the price of the books. But anyway, that's the easiest place is Watchman Press. If they don't want to go there, they can go to Amazon or something and just search my name and they can find all the books. I've got several nonfiction books about preparedness I think are pretty good. If you read people's reviews of them, I think they think they're helpful. And then I've got an interesting series called The Survivalist, which is a post-pandemic U.S. Marshal and his dog wandering the wasteland kind of story. But it's a lot of fun. It's 12 books. People seem to like it as well. Now,
that's for the books. What about all these lovely devices you've been showing us?
Yes. So I've got a lot of great, we only showed some of these cool devices. They need to go to disasterpreparer.com. Maybe you can put a link to that. It's been around for, I guess, about 5 years now. I think it's like the place you go for EMP products. There's a lot of information about EMP on there as well. And you can get these DEFCON devices. You can get the ferrites. You can get the traps. There's a lot of they've put a bunch of bundles and stuff to help people save a little money and stuff. Some of this stuff's kind of expensive. The most expensive stuff, believe it or not, is this cloth, which is crazy expensive to build like a car cover out of it, which is why we looked at some of these devices that you can put on them. But yeah, disasterpreparer.com for anything EMP related.
Well, Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, EMP expert, NASA scientist, founder of disasterpreparer.com. We're just grateful that you're visiting us again. It's been far too long. We'd like to have you back again. And next time I'm going to call for viewers' questions prior to your arrival so that we can focus in on some things we didn't cover today. Felt like we had some pretty wide-ranging discussion today. I enjoyed it. Hope you did. And I bet our viewers will as well. Folks, go ahead and put your comments in the discussion below this video, and we will see if we can get Dr. Bradley back on to answer your specific questions. So on behalf of all of our viewers, just thanks for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks for having me on. It was great.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for May 13th through May 20th, 2024, while supplies last. First, we feature 1 ounce Gold Krugerrand at $49.99 over spot. We also have 2023 Silver 1 ounce Krugerrand at $3.10 over spot. And finally, we have Silver half-ounce Canadian Polar Bears at $2.50 over melt. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.